Excellent. All right. We have today Gershon Baskin. Dr. Gershon Baskin is the Middle East Director of International Communities Organization, a UK-based NGO working in conflict zones with failed peace processes. Together with Samer Sinijlawi, founded the Alliance for Two States. He is a veteran Israel peace activist for 47 years. He specialized in running secret direct back channels. He has negotiated with Hamas for 18 years, sometimes officially and most of the time unofficially. Welcome, Gershon Baskin. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for hosting me.
Yes, it is our honor and our pleasure to have you. And thank you for taking the time with us to speak with us. I wanted to ask first and foremost, is Israel guilty of genocide and war crimes in Gaza?
Well, you start right at the heart of the
I
issue.
start, I start.
Um, right. Well, I must say it pains me. It pains me physically as an Israeli and as a Jew to say that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. I want to be clear, this is not the Holocaust. It's not what the Nazis did to the Jews. But the definition of genocide is not how many people you kill and how quickly you kill them. The definition of genocide comes from the Convention for the Prevention of Genocide, which was written in 1948. Jews participated in the writing of that convention after World War II, after the Holocaust. And it's very clear that what Israel is doing in Gaza is a genocide. Israel is erasing a civilization. Israel has turned Gaza into an uninhabitable place. It has made 2 million people homeless. It has destroyed all the schools, the universities, the public buildings, libraries, churches, mosques, roads, water infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, sewage infrastructure. Gaza has been rendered uninhabitable by its 2.3 million people. And this is what a genocide is. I want to also note that every country which is a signatory to the Convention for the Prevention of Genocide is responsible for making sure that it doesn't happen, and if it is happening, to prevent it, to stop it. And every country which is not doing everything in its power to stop the genocide in Gaza is also complicit in the genocide. It's a very complex issue, and it requires the countries of the world to do something, most of whom are not doing anything to stop it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And we know that you've been deeply involved in negotiations, including discussions around the Gaza ceasefires and hostage releases. Why, in your opinion, did Israel break the ceasefires that were in place previously?
I think it's very clear when the deal that was negotiated and agreed to was presented by President Biden way back in May of last year. It was a bad deal. I called it out as a bad deal right from the beginning because it was a deal that didn't guarantee an end to the war. It didn't release all the hostages. It didn't guarantee an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. And I had noted back then that there were 100 different points of exit from the deal. The deal had requirements to it. One of the most important requirements were that the parties were going to enter into negotiations on a permanent ceasefire by day 15, which would be concluded by day 30. That was a 60-day ceasefire that those talks never began on day 15 or 16 or 17 or concluded by day 30. They never concluded. And a few days after the end of the period of the agreed upon ceasefire, Israel decided to resume the war. Israel does not want to end the war. Prime Minister Netanyahu does not want to end the war. This war is his political survival, and everything that he says otherwise is a lie. Israel has done everything to prolong the war, to keep it going. People from Hamas told me that they were very confused. They didn't understand why Israel was demanding to release half the hostages, not all the hostages. There are 50 hostages remaining in Gaza, 20 of whom are believed to be alive. And even until recently, in the last week, Israel has been trying to negotiate a partial deal, not a comprehensive deal, something that the other side, Hamas, didn't understand whatsoever.
And what about the ceasefire that was broken back in early of March? I remember it was in place,
This is
and
the ceasefire I'm talking about. This is the deal that I'm talking about. It went into effect on the 19th of January and lasted until mid-March. It was the deal that President Trump told the Israelis that he wants the deal done before he enters the White House, and it was concluded on January 19th, the day before Trump was sworn in. And it was supposed to be converted into a permanent ceasefire, a sustainable ceasefire, as they called it. But the talk after the end of the ceasefire period was determined.
And could you explain in detail and tell us what you received from Hamas last August in regards to releasing the hostages and commitment to end the war?
As I noted in May, when President Biden presented the deal that they were negotiating on, moving forward, I was approached by families of hostages who asked me to see if I could talk to see if Hamas was willing to do a deal that would bring all the hostages home in the war. I made my contacts with the Hamas people that I deal with. There were more or less now 8 Hamas leaders that I communicate with on a regular basis. All of them are outside of Gaza. None of them are in Gaza. No, I don't have any contact with the Hamas people in Gaza. Before talking to them, I approached some people from the Israeli military, some experts, and I asked them how long would it take Israel to withdraw completely from the Gaza Strip. And the figure that I got was 3 weeks. So I approached Hamas and I asked them, would you be willing to make a deal that would end the war in 3 weeks? Israel would withdraw from Gaza entirely. You would release all the hostages within a 3-week period. Israel would release an agreed to list of names of Palestinian prisoners from Israel. Some of them are also being held as hostage. And that would conclude this chapter in our history of warfare between Israel and Hamas. Hamas accepted the deal. They gave it to me in writing in English and in Arabic, and they added to it, without a request from me, that Hamas had decided that it was willing to no longer govern the Gaza Strip. They were willing to turn over Gaza to a civilian, professional, technocratic administration of Palestinians that would have all the authorities. I tried to clarify with them at that time when they said all the authorities, does that mean security-related authorities? And they said yes, but it was the but was that they weren't really to put down their weapons or give their weapons over to the new government. This was an unclear point. I communicated this back to the families, and I communicated back to the Israeli negotiators, had a back and forth on WhatsApp. One of the 3 chief Israeli negotiators at the time, who said, it's a great deal, but the problem is that the Prime Minister doesn't agree to end the war. And I had a back and forth with him. It was very clear that the Israelis were not going to go for it. I tried to pass this on to the Americans. I know that it got to the desk of President Biden. I know that President Biden gave it over to his point man who was dealing with this issue, who was Brett McGurk. I met with 2 of Brett McGurk's people in a hotel in Tel Aviv, who told me that Brett McGurk wouldn't even look at it, that he was entirely focused on the bad deal that he was trying to negotiate. I went to Doha. I met with the Doha negotiating team. I met with the Egyptian Mukhabarat, the Egyptian intelligence. It basically got all around. I went public with it on television and in Israel and on radio around the world. I got called by a retired Israeli general who's very well known and has a great track record. And he said, let me try. And I did another brief negotiation with Hamas, with the general who drafted a paper. And eventually, after 2 or 3 rounds, Hamas agreed to it. And then the general went on television and said, I negotiated with Hamas, and this is the results that I got. But it had no traction. It wasn't moving anywhere. So already this was back in September. We got the final papers, I think September 10th or something like that, in Arabic and in Hebrew. But you can look on the internet around for the 3 weeks deal. It's out there. A few people made social media groups called the 3 weeks deal, both on Blue Sky and X, and I don't know where else, but people were talking about it. What we know today is that Hamas is willing to make a deal that would end the war within a week. And today, Israel could withdraw entirely from Gaza in a week. Hamas said they're willing to return all 50 hostages in 24 to 48 hours. And once again, they repeat that they have no intention of continuing to govern Gaza. The big missing link here, or the missing piece of the puzzle in the middle of the puzzle, is that there's been no Palestinian determination of who's going to govern Gaza if Hamas is no longer governing Gaza. And this is really irresponsible on the part of the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian president, or whoever else has to make a decision in Palestine. I know there are two Palestinians who have stood up and said that they're willing to be a governor for Gaza, take over the governance of Gaza, but it's not clear how they do that. One of them is Nasser al-Qudwa, the former foreign minister of the Palestinian Authority, the PLO representative of the United Nations for 17 years. Dr. al-Qudwa is the nephew of Yasser Arafat. He has a very good track record. He is in exile, living in France now, because in May of 2021, when there were supposed to be Palestinian elections, Dr. Nasser al-Qudwa formed a list of mostly Fatah people who were in opposition to Mahmoud Abbas. Dr. Qudwa's list was supported by Marwan Barghouti. In fact, Marwan's wife, Fadwa, was number 2 on Nasser's list. Abbas canceled those elections, of course, we know that. He said that because Israel wouldn't allow the elections to take place in East Jerusalem. I never understood why Abbas even asked Israel to conduct the elections in East Jerusalem. And just for a matter of fact, Israel never answered. They never said no. They never said yes. And Mahmoud Abbas canceled those elections because it was clear that he was going to lose. Not that Hamas would win. Hamas wouldn't have won those elections. But the opposition to Abbas and Fatah would have won on several lists. And they were agreeing to make a coalition. In any event, Nasser Qudwa has stood up and said, I'm willing to form a government to Gaza. He was in Cairo 2 weeks ago and held meetings with members of all the factions, all the Palestinian factions. He met with the Egyptian intelligence folks also, and the foreign minister and other people. And I know that Dr. Nasser is willing to take the job, and he believes that Gaza has to be under a temporary government until Palestinians can hold elections. Abbas has said within a year. Now it's 10 months since the time that he gave that obligation. And Nasser also supports Palestinian elections. He thinks that a Palestinian civilian technocratic government in Gaza could be formed of mostly Gazans who would be respected and viable and agree to work. They would invite a temporary Arab-led security force to come to Gaza to assist. The Arab-led security force would not engage in the disarming of Hamas. That's the responsibility of the Palestinian government, and no foreigners of doing that. And he has a whole plan on reconstruction and engaging with the United States and Europe and with Israel, to be frank. The other person this week who's become public and known that he stood up and said he's willing to be a governor for Gaza and claims that he has the support of Egypt, the Saudis, and the Jordanians, and perhaps others, is Samer. Samer, I know very well since 1989. He was the technical assistant of Dr. Said Nusseibeh during the Madrid process, the multilateral talks. He formed the multilateral working groups for the Palestinian side. He was the first Director General of the Palestinian Authority Ministry of National Economy. He had negotiated with Israel on economic affairs. He went on later to work in the private sector. He built Nasar, a stone industry business in Beit Lechem into an empire, negotiated a deal with Israel, the first trusted traders deal where Samer bought for the company Israeli-owned trucks driven by Palestinian Israeli drivers that went from the factory in Beit Lechem right to the port or to its selling points, Israel without being stopped at the checkpoints. He later went to the Negotiator, the largest Palestinian conglomerate, owns Paltel and Jawal and the Palestinian Stock Exchange and a bunch of other companies. It's part of the Masri family business. After that, Samer went on to build a neighborhood in Jerusalem, in Jericho, the Jericho Gate Hotel, and recently he's been the chairman of the Palestinian Stock Exchange until he was recently fired by Abbas again for political reasons. So these are two respected Palestinians who have stood up and said they're willing to fill this void that would exist. One of the things that the Americans have told me is that they have difficulty putting pressure on Israel because Israel comes to them and says, we're willing to leave Gaza, but if we do, Hamas remains there. It's the only armed group which has control of Gaza. We can't allow Hamas to continue to rule there. So it is really the Palestinian responsibility to pick up and say, no. There is a Palestinian responsible government that's going to take control of Gaza.
But we are now seeing that Netanyahu has solidified interest in and is putting a plan in place to both an occupation of Gaza and recently came out to speak about a greater Israel. What does a total siege of Gaza look like? And what's this concept of a greater Israel that he's speaking about?
Well, it's everything that Israel has done in the last 22 months on steroids. That's what it is. They're talking about drafting now 150,000 reservists. I think a lot of them, maybe even a majority of them, won't even show up for duty. These people have done 300, 400 days already of reserve duty, and they're in no way going to go and do this. This plan has very little support in the Israeli public. It also has little support in the Israeli army, but this is the plan. And if the government gives the order, the army has to implement it. And what it is there are three areas of Gaza, which have all been attacked in the past by Israel, which are enclaves of so-called humanitarian safe zones. One is in the city of Gaza itself, where it's believed there are about 700,000 to 800,000 Gazans living, most of them living in destroyed buildings or in tents. It's in the center area of the Nusrat and Dir al-Balah refugee camps, where again, they've been largely destroyed already. Most of the people living there are living in tents. And the Israelis want to push them into the southwest corner of Gaza, the Mawasi area along the coast. And with the pressure, according to what Ben Gvir and Smotrich say, they'll open up the gates and let Palestinians leave. Behind the scenes, we've heard reports in the media that Israel's been negotiating with various countries. Some have denied it entirely already, like South Sudan, that would accept Palestinian refugees from Gaza to reside in those countries. But we've heard the names of countries like South Sudan, like Indonesia, like Malaysia. I don't think that any of these countries are actually negotiating it. I think this is really hype in the media. What Israel is planning to do is to continue doing more war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza. And Israel needs to be stopped.
Oof. Thank you for that. And
I
man,
should
there's
add,
just,
Taz, I should
yeah,
add
go ahead.
that Israel's committing war crimes in the West Bank also.
Yes.
and this,
Could you elaborate
so that everyone
on
listening
what
knows.
that is? Yeah, can you elaborate on
Yeah,
your what you've been seeing?
there are more than 40 new settlements that have been built in the West Bank. I don't know the exact number, but I think it's more than 40 new settlements have been built since the beginning of the war. I think that close to, I don't want to throw out a number, but it's hundreds. Somewhere in the back of my mind, it tells me it's close to 1,000, but I don't want to throw that number out. It's been hundreds of Palestinians in the West Bank killed since the beginning of the war by Israeli settlers and by the Israeli army and the Israeli police. The Israeli army in the West Bank, which is now controlled by Smotrich, and the police, which is controlled by Ben Gvir, are completely facilitating the evacuation of Palestinian villages, mostly in Area C, but they're beginning to hit Area B also. This is pure ethnic cleansing and the use of violence. And the settlers who kill Palestinians are never brought to justice. Some of them are brought and put under house arrest and then are freed. We never hear of any cases that are taken to court and people actually are prosecuted for murder, which is what they're doing. And there's an ongoing daily violent events against Palestinians in the West Bank. We also know that there are 1,000 checkpoints in the West Bank. It has made life impossible in the West Bank. To travel from Ramallah to Nablus or to Tulkarm or Jenin can take a full day, 4 or 5 hours in each direction, because of all the checkpoints that people have to go through. And the checkpoints are not always open. Sometimes they're just a closed gate, and you have to wait for some soldiers to open it. Sometimes they open it, sometimes they don't. In addition to this, about 150,000 Palestinians from the West Bank who worked in Israel before the war 22 months ago have been unemployed since. They provided a great deal of the income that exists within the Palestinian economy, and that income isn't there anymore. And people are literally hungry in the West Bank, not just in Gaza, where they're being starved. In the West Bank, people don't have money to buy food. It's a really tragic situation. It's not talked about enough. People don't know it enough. I'm sure that the people here know it better than most, but still, it's not in the media whatsoever. And it's part of the tragic reality of this horrible Israeli government that we have and what this government is doing, again, with the entire world, providing Israel with impunity for doing it.
Thank you. And that's very important that you mentioned that because a lot of people, like you mentioned, this is not on the news media or the outlets, and not many people know and understand what is happening inside of the West Bank. But you mentioned Smotrich, and I wanted to mention this. So Israel's finance minister, Smotrich, came out earlier this year, and he mentioned that the hostages are not top priority. What outrage did this spark in Israel, and what are the families of the hostages saying about the current government's lack of interest in recovering the hostages through an appropriate ceasefire?
The hostage families are desperate. They're in despair. They are feeling abandoned. Everyone knows that the government and the army of Israel abandoned their responsibility to defend the border of Israel on October 7th, and they have failed to bring back the hostages since then. I've been saying since the very beginning of the war that the government has decided to sacrifice the hostages. And they keep putting it off with making bold statements how the hostages return is essential and they're working on it 24/7. And that's quite frankly a lot of bullshit. It's very clear now from Netanyahu in his last press conference. He said that the hostages are the second priority. The first priority is to get Hamas to surrender. And this last military operation they're planning to fully conquer the entire West Bank and occupy it is aimed at what they call forcing Hamas to surrender. Oh, this is the reality of what we're facing right now. Smotrich is one of those forces in Israel has said over the years that from his perspective, Hamas was an asset and the Palestinian Authority was a liability. The policy of Benjamin Netanyahu since 2009, when he returned to the prime minister's office, has been to divide and conquer the Palestinian people, to ensure the division between West Bank and Gaza, between Fatah and Hamas. And he delegitimized Fatah and Mahmoud Abbas on an ongoing basis. In the early days after Abbas was elected, after the death of Arafat in 2005, Abbas was actually committed to negotiating peace with Israel, but he had no partner in Israel. And for years, he held legitimacy within the Palestinian Authority. He has very little legitimacy today, but a lot of his legitimacy was taken away from him by Netanyahu and his governments since then, who failed to recognize that there was a potential partner for peace in the Palestinian Authority, and Israel wasn't interested in making peace.
Now, would you put the blame on Israel? Because you have come out and said, and I want you to elaborate on this, about Israel being the most disliked country in the world, and what, factors have come out in driving this perception all over the world. Would you say that Israel is doing what is happening to themselves, and this hate and the continued oppression of the Palestinian people would drive, the response from Palestinians to, want this equal rights and liberation for themselves? And then obviously you mentioned prior in previous interviews as Israel becoming one of the most disliked country in the world. Why would you say that?
Yeah, first of all, let me just say that Israel had to respond militarily on after October 7th. Um, It had to respond because Israel failed to protect itself, failed to protect its border, failed to protect its citizens. And the neighborhood in which we live here in the Middle East is one that if you project weakness, then you're very vulnerable to additional attacks. So there was a need for a swift Israeli military attack. It should have been directed only at Hamas, not at the Palestinian people, not at Gaza. It should have been over within a week or 2 weeks maximum. And then Israel should have convened conference together with all the neighborhood, with Egypt and Jordan and the Saudis and the Emiratis and Bahrain and even Morocco and Turkey and the United States and Europe, and should have decided what do we do with Gaza? How do we change the situation in Gaza? How do we remove the threat from Israel from Gaza? And how do we move forward with a political arrangement or a deal that's going to address resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and no longer just managing it? But Israel didn't do that. What I tell people all the time is when people say no choice, what's the choices? There are always choices to be made. And the choice that Israel made to this horrific war in Gaza now for 22 months, killing so many people, destroying Gaza, making uninhabitable, has put Israel in a position where the world does not understand what Israel is doing. The world had sympathy for Israel after October 7th, and that sympathy was lost if we've seen the destruction and the death of innocent Palestinian women and children and elderly people and men and non-combatants, and the total destruction of Gaza, the wiping out of entire towns and cities and refugee camps in the Gaza Strip. The Israeli public doesn't see it. Our media doesn't present it. Most of the feed comes from local broadcasters, journalists in Gaza who haven't yet been killed by Israel, because they've killed about 200 journalists in Israel in Gaza in the last 22 months. So Israel pushes those reporters off the table as being biased and not objective and anti-Semitic and everything else. But the world is now seeing Gaza in their living rooms every day, on their televisions and on their telephones and the social media. The pictures are there. You can't hide it. Israel has refused to allow international media into Gaza to see the reality. The Israeli media has become very shallow and superficial and repetitive of lies. Sometimes I feel like I'm listening to the army spokesperson all the time in listening to what our media has to present. On each one of our mainstream channels, there are a couple of journalists who are more honest and direct and present the real issues at hand here, but most of the Israelis don't see them, but the world is seeing it. And Israelis are now experiencing the reality of not being welcomed around the world. Not only are there warrants for the arrest for Netanyahu and for the former Minister of Defense, there will be warrants coming down for a lot of officers and a lot of Israelis. And Israelis are being told by the government of Israel not to display signs of Hebrew and not to speak Hebrew loudly, not to show that you're an Israeli when you're traveling abroad. Israelis love to travel, and our world is going to become very, very small because there are very few places in the world where Israelis are going to feel welcome. They're already experiencing that now, and it's just going to be worse for Israelis.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gershon Baskin.
هو انت جد الأحرار جد الفلسطيني